This game was played in the US Class Championship in 1995. My opponent is a very strong grandmaster named Alexander Yermolinsky, and he's a fantastic endgame player, very, very hard to beat. In fact, I've played a number of better endgames against him, and I only managed to win this one. Let's take a look at it. Here, it's even material. We're going to focus on the position in a few moves, but I want to show you the transition into the endgame. Here I have two bishops. I have a queenside majority, which is obviously going to prove useful in the endgame. He's threatening to play the move f5, maybe. Often when you have two bishops, you want to maintain them, because they can be very strong against two knights, or against bishop and knight. But here I played an unusual move. It may seem like the most obvious move to one kind of player, but to another player it seems like the most difficult kind of move. The relationship between bishop and knight in this position is that I can take his knight whenever I want to, and he can't do anything about it. For that reason, logically, there's no reason for me to take it, because I can maintain that tension. It's to my advantage. But in this position, precisely, bishop takes d6 wins a pawn. Bishop takes d6. Now, if he plays knight takes d6, then he has a big problem, because after the move c3, his rook can't defend the c3 pawn and defend his knight. After b takes c3, b takes c3. If he plays rook c2, I play rook takes d6, which is, by the way, defending my knight from his bishop, and I win a piece. And if he plays rook d1, then I just play c2, and he has to play rook c1 now, and then I win his knight, rook takes d6. If he takes with the rook, then I also win by force. I play rook takes d6, knight takes d6, c3, b takes c3, b takes c3, king e1, knight b4. My pawn is very, very hard to defend. I'm threatening his a2 pawn. If he moves it, then I play knight c2 check. And then if he plays king d1, knight e3 check will win a piece. And if he goes to f2, then my c3 pawn will be impossible to stop. His only move here would have been to play king d1, after which I play bishop takes a2, and once again we see two weaknesses, and my a6 and c3 pawns will be impossible to stop. So it's strange. We see that after bishop takes d6, he can't recapture my bishop either way. Both rook takes d6 and knight takes d6 are impossible. And you know, it might be hard to understand how a grandmaster, a very strong grandmaster like Yermolinsky, could miss a move like bishop takes d6, while a master might not have missed the move at all. The reason is because of his class. There are certain moves which grandmasters intuitively look past because they're unnatural. In this type of position, all the instincts of a strong player say that black should not take the knight, because the bishop on e7 is very strong, and it's a tension which is to my advantage. His last move was king f1, which was a big mistake. He overlooked the move because it was unnatural. Bishop takes d6 then. He had to play the move f5. He doesn't lose a piece, but he does lose a pawn. So now if I were to go back, bishop c8, then after rook takes d6, knight takes d6, he wouldn't be attacking a2 pawn after c3, and the position would be more easy to defend. After f5, I played bishop e5, and here he played f takes e6, f takes e6, rook takes d8, knight takes d8. And here we have the endgame. Once again we notice that there are bishops of opposite color. As we saw in the last game against Moscow, it's very hard to win those types of endgames. The knights are important for me. I want to keep the knights on the board. There's no reason for me to allow him to reach a drawish endgame. And so the technique that I used here is quite similar to the one I used in the last game. I want to create weaknesses. First of all, his pawn on b2 is hanging and he has to do something about it. He played b3. If he were to play knight d2, I could play c3 and get the pass pawn that way. After b3, I played c3, a protected pass pawn. Now this change is to my advantage in that I have a protected pass pawn now on c3, and it's to his advantage in that he's locked my pawns on the same color as my bishop, and he can create a light square blockade. His king on c2 or bishop on c2 will be very hard to dislodge. Now, create a plan for black. What should I do? Let's look at this position logically. First of all, I'm up a pawn. I'm obviously much better. But how do I make progress? His knight on e4 is very strong. His bishop on that diagonal will also be very strong. But it should be noticed that both his bishop and his knight are optimally placed on the same diagonal. They're a little redundant. That's to my advantage. Also, his knight on e4 is very important to guard his dark squares. Potentially, my king wants to come in to the king side, the g5 and h4 squares. His king will be necessary to defend on the queen side. His king will probably defend on c2. That understood, I should create weaknesses on the king side, exploit that side of the board. And so it becomes clear that I'm going to use the queenside as a way to lull his defenses that way, and then I'll try to take advantage of weaknesses that I've created on the kingside. That's the plan. Also, of course, it's good for me to create an active knight. Moves like knight c6 to d4 come into mind. Maybe I can get my knight to the f4 square, to the e3 square. He has dark square holes. He has control of the light squares, I have control of the dark squares. Both of us have pluses and minuses. Now it's time to create some weaknesses and try to get in there. He played king e1. My first move, as usual, was to bring my king in, king f7. He played king d1. He can't really bring his bishop to the defense of the queenside, because to do that he has to move his knight, and once he moves his knight, he releases my king to enter his kingside. After king d1, I played the important move, king g6. This ties his knight down to the e4 square, and also indirectly paralyzes his bishop. His knight can't move because of king g5 to h4, and his bishop can't move because the knight blocks it in. My king on g6 makes both his knight on e4 and his bishop on g2 passive. Very important. He played bishop f3. His weakness of the g5 square is hard to deal with, and he might be preparing the move h4. But that's what I want him to do. I want him to push his pawns. I want to make them weak. After bishop f3, I played a5. Potentially, he could play knight c5 and attack the pawn, defending my b4 pawn, getting my pawn off a light square. A detail again, improving my position. And now he played the move h4. He saw my plan. My next few moves were going to be knight c6 to d4. Notice that when my pawn was on e6, if I played knight c6, he would play knight c5, attacking both my knight on c6 and my pawn on a6. Now that he has no good discoveries on my knight, I want to do that. He played h4. A weakness. Now my king has done its work. My king being on g6 provoked the weakness. Now I can go elsewhere. King f7. Patience. The conversion of my advantage in this endgame is all about understatement. Everything I do is indirect. I played king g6 just to have the potential of breaking through on the king's side. I enticed the h-pawn up the board. Then I went back. No problem. Now my king will look for other work. He played king c2. King e7. He played knight c5. My threat was knight c6. I wanted to come into the d4 square. Notice, of course, that last move it would have been a big mistake to play knight c6. Knight c6, he has the move knight d6 check. After I take it, bishop takes c6, and he's reached a bishop of opposite color endgame. Very drawish. I don't want to allow that. If we think about an optimal setup for him, put his pawn on h5 and his bishop on f3, his king on d3. Very, very hard to make progress here. Maybe I can, maybe not. But the key is for me to keep all of my options open. There's no reason for me to allow this trade. I played king e7. He played knight c5. He needs to release his bishop from the king's side. Now that his knight is moved, I can do what I wanted. I played the move bishop g3. Attacking the weak h4 pawn, he has to push it up the board, and now he has further weaknesses on the king's side. So notice, I brought my king to g6 to provoke h4, then I took my king away. Then he moved his knight away, and then I played bishop g3. This is an endgame of understatement, of feints. Now he's forced to play h5, and he has a weak g5 square, a hole that I'll take advantage of later. I played knight f7, going for the squares that he's weakened. Now my knight can come to g5 and e5. If he plays knight b7 attacking my a5 pawn, I can just go back with bishop c7 and defend it, no problem. He played e3. His point is that he saw that if I trade knight for bishop, I'll be winning. My threat was knight e5, and whenever I want to, I can play knight takes f3. His king will be stuck defending the c3 pawn, and my king can enter the dark squares. Big trouble for him. Now notice, for example, that if we made the trade, knight takes f3, e takes f3, and my king were to come to the f4 square, I'd be attacking the base of his pawn chain, the f3 pawn, and the only way to defend it would be with the knight from a dark square. The only way for a knight to defend a light square is from a dark square. And by definition, with the knight on d4, defending a light square, my bishop can attack it on a dark square. And this is part of the advantage of bishop and king against knight and king. The knight can't defend its weaknesses, because if the pawns are all on the same color of the bishop, then the bishop can attack the pawns. If the knight is defending the pawns, then the bishop can attack the knight. The knight can't do all of its work from the opposite color of the bishop. Compare this, for example, to if there were a white bishop on e4 instead of a knight. This position would be easily drawn. because the bishop can defend the pawns from the same color of the pawns, and my bishop can't do anything. Now he can just go back and forth for the whole game. Easy draw. So I played knight f7, knight e5. Again, this is more about potential than it's about realization. If I play knight e5, I'm not necessarily going to take the bishop. I might just want to move my bishop off the forking square, e4, and then I can try to either bring my king to f6 and g5. Maybe I can move my knight to g5 and bring my king to e5. I can trade, but I can also just have the potential for the trade. Who's to say what I'll really do? I want to keep my opponent dealing with a lot of problems. After knight f7, e3, I played bishop f2. He's created a new weakness. Naturally, I want to attack it. He can't play e4 because I'll take the knight on c5. If he plays king d3, I have knight e5 check. And now he's in trouble. After king e2, c2, I win a piece because there's no way for him to defend everything. If he moves his king over to d2, defending the queening square, I can play knight takes f3, I've won a piece. And if he plays knight d3, defending the queening square, I just play knight takes d3, and next I make a queen. His king would be overloaded on d3. It's stuck to pure defense on the c2 square, and once again we see the value of an active king. I've kept his king by my pawn on c3 defending, and my king is provoking weaknesses everywhere, and eventually it will enter. After bishop f2, he played knight b7, attacking my a5 pawn. I played knight e5, attacking his bishop. He had to go back with bishop d1. I play bishop takes e3. Knight takes a5. Black to move. What would you do? So now the key trade has taken place. I've taken off his e3 pawn for my a5 pawn. The a5 pawn was kind of irrelevant, and now I have the second weakness. My e6 pawn is a passer. He has to deal with both c3 and e6, and with the weakness on g4. I play the simple move, bishop c5. And here the decentralization of his knight becomes very obvious. He has two possibilities to try to bring it back into the game. Obviously his king can't really move, and his bishop is stuck defending the g4 pawn. My next two moves will be king f6 to g5, followed by knight takes g4. He's in trouble. If he plays the move knight b7, trying to get in that way, obviously I cover the c6 square with my knight. After knight b7, bishop b6, he can resign the game because his knight is trapped. There's nowhere to go. I cover a5 and c5 with my bishop d6, and d8 are covered by the king. My next two moves will be king d7 to c7. He can't defend with bishop f3 because my knight guards that square. I'll just take the knight and win. If he tries the desperate idea of bishop e2, king to c7, bishop a6 to defend the knight from that square, and in truth that's the only way he can hope to do it. Then his pieces are tied down ridiculously. My next two moves will just simply be knight g4, knight e3 check, or maybe even knight g4, knight f6, and then take the h5 pawn. He can't do anything. His pieces are terrible, and I win the game. His only other option with the knight would be to play knight c4, offering a trade into a bishop opposite color endgame, and this is one time that I would accept the trade. Now I could play knight c6, followed by knight d4 check and win, but the best move is the simplest move. Knight takes c4, b takes c4, and now because of the two weaknesses, or potentially three weaknesses if you include the g4 pawn, the position is impossible to defend. I just play king f6, king d3, king e5. My next move will be king f4, and he can't stop it because I guard the e3 square, so he has to play passive moves, say king back to c2. Then I play king f4. He has to waste time, king d3. I would play e5, king c2, e4. Now I guard the d3 and d2 squares. Say he tries a move like bishop e2. Then I would just play king e3, attacking the bishop. If he defends with king d1, then c2 check forces the king off of the bishop and I win a piece. He has to go back to d1. Then I play king f2. He has absolutely no play. My next two moves will be e3 and e2. I win a piece and win the game. The bishop endgame would be very easily winning. So if he were to play knight c4, I would accept this offer to trade into a bishop opposite color endgame because I would see that it was very easily winning. The last option which he would have is to try desperately to create some counterplay by the move a4, creating a passed pawn. But this too would lose. My response would be b takes a3 en passant, and after king takes c3, do you see the move? Take your time and find the right tactic. I would just play bishop d4 check. I force the queening of my pawn. If the king moves back to c2, then I play a2, and I guard the b2 square. The pawn guards the b1 square. He can't stop me from queening. and if he accepts the sacrifice, king takes d4. Then after a2, there's no way to stop the pawn, and I win. So returning to this position, the only three options he had were a4, knight c4, and knight b7. They all lose. He saw that, and he resigned. So if you go back and think about this endgame, I won with understatement. A big part of endgame technique is provoking your opponent in the course of his defense to create new problems for himself. That was how I won this game.